In the small town of Millbrook Falls, tucked between low green hills and a slow-moving creek, there is a library on the corner of Oak and 3rd Street, and for 41 years, the quiet, unassuming woman who ran it was named Eleanor Voss. She was not the kind of person anyone would call rich. Her cardigans had elbow patches sewn on by her own hand. Her car was a 1989 hatchback with a cracked side mirror held together with electrical tape. She rode her bicycle to work most mornings, rain or shine, a wicker basket strapped to the front, where she carried her lunch in a tin box that had belonged to her mother. Eleanor had grown up poor, the daughter of a mill worker who lost his job twice before she turned 12. She remembered standing in the school hallway in shoes 2 sizes too small, watching other children unwrap sandwiches while she pretended she wasn't hungry. She remembered those memories never left her, but instead of making her bitter, they made her careful. To her mother crying quietly in the kitchen, there was one afternoon in particular that Eleanor carried with her for the rest of her life. She was 11 years old, and a teacher had asked the class to bring in a book from home to share. Eleanor had no books of her own. She walked 2 miles to the Millbrook Falls Library that same afternoon, alone, and a kind librarian named Mrs. Halloway let her borrow a worn copy of a novel. No questions asked. No late fee mentioned even when Eleanor kept it 3 weeks past its due date because she was too embarrassed to admit she'd lost track of time enjoying it. Eleanor never forgot that kindness. She decided right there in the stacks at 11 years old that she wanted to spend her life being the person who handed a child a book instead of a bill, thinking no one could hear. At 23, fresh out of library school with a modest degree and an even more modest salary, Eleanor opened her first investment account with $300. It wasn't much. It felt, if anything, like a small act of defiance against the poverty of her childhood. She chose a broad, low-cost index fund, the kind that simply tracked the market instead of trying to beat it. And she made herself a promise. Every single month, no matter what, she would add something to it. $10, $20, whatever she could spare after rent and groceries and the modest tithe she gave to the church down the road. She never spoke of it. Not to her co-workers, not to the patrons who came in every day to browse the stacks, not even to her closest friend, a retired schoolteacher named Doris who lived 2 doors down. Eleanor believed that money, like grief, was something best carried quietly. Doris and Eleanor had known each other for nearly 30 years. Ever since Doris moved into the small house across the street with her husband, a truck driver who was rarely home. The 2 women fell into an easy rhythm. Tuesday evening tea, Sunday walks along the creek behind the library. The occasional shared casserole passed over the fence when one of them had a hard week. Doris knew about Eleanor's childhood, her divorce, her sister's illness. She did not know about the account. Not because Eleanor didn't trust her, but because Eleanor had learned early that talking about money, even quietly, even with someone she loved, had a way of changing how people looked at her, and she wanted, more than almost anything else in her life, to simply be seen as herself. In October of 1987, the market fell harder in a single day than it had in living memory. Eleanor still remembered standing behind the checkout desk, listening to 2 men argue about the crash near the newspaper rack. One insisting the whole system was collapsing, the other quietly folding his paper and walking out without a word. That evening, Eleanor went home, opened her modest statement, and watched the number staring back at her shrink by nearly a quarter in value. Her hands shook slightly as she read it. But she did not call her broker. She did not sell a single share. Instead, she took her usual $20, walked to the small bank branch on Main Street the following Monday morning, and added it to the account exactly as she always did, buying shares at a lower price than she'd paid the month before. Though she barely thought of it that way at the time, she simply thought, this is what I do on the first of the month. The 1980s gave way to recession, and Eleanor kept contributing. She watched her modest balance dip in value during downturns that made the evening news, downturns that had her neighbors pulling their savings out of the market in a panic. Eleanor did not pull hers out. She had read enough, in her own library, in the financial section she quietly maintained and restocked herself, to understand a simple truth. The market has always recovered, given enough time for those patient enough to wait. 2 decades later, in the autumn of 2008, the pattern repeated itself, only louder. Banks failed, neighbors lost homes. A regular patron named Harold, who came in every Tuesday for the newspaper, told Eleanor across the counter that he had pulled every dollar of his retirement savings into cash, certain the entire system was ending. Eleanor only nodded, said she hoped things worked out for him, and said nothing about her own account. She kept contributing that November and the November after that, through headlines that spoke of collapse and ruin. 5 years later, when the market had not only recovered, but grown well beyond where it had been before the crisis, Harold never mentioned his decision again, and Eleanor never brought it up. She wasn't in the business of being right. She was in the business of being steady. When her dividends came in, she reinvested every cent. She did not touch that money, not once, not through her divorce in her 30s, not through the roof that needed replacing, not through the years she helped her sister pay for a nursing home. She found other ways to solve those problems. Her divorce, in particular, tested her resolve. Her husband at the time, a man named Frank, who sold insurance 2 towns over, grew frustrated that Eleanor wouldn't discuss finances with him the way he wanted, wouldn't move the money into investments he'd read about in a magazine, promising faster returns. Their marriage ended not over any single dramatic argument, but over years of quiet mismatch, and when it finally ended, Eleanor took on legal fees and a modest apartment deposit, using money she scraped together from extra shifts at the front desk and by selling her grandmother's old dining set. She never once considered touching the account. When her sister Margaret grew too ill to live alone, Eleanor visited a nursing home 3 counties away every other weekend for nearly 4 years, driving her rattling hatchback down back roads to sit by her sister's bedside, paying what she could from her salary and taking on a part-time job cataloguing archives at a nearby historical society to cover the rest. The investment account remained untouched, growing in silence, compounding in the dark the way a seed compounds beneath soil before anyone sees the sprout. She lived on a librarian's salary her entire life. She clipped coupons. She darned her own socks. She grew tomatoes in the small yard behind her rented house and canned them each August so she wouldn't need to buy vegetables through the winter. To the town of Millbrook Falls, she was simply the librarian, warm and unassuming, the woman who remembered every child's name and always seemed to know exactly which book a person needed before they knew it themselves. What no one knew was that by the time Eleanor turned 50, her quiet monthly contributions and untouched dividends had grown into a sum larger than most people in town would earn across an entire working lifetime. She kept working. She loved her job, the smell of old paper, the hush of the reading room, the particular satisfaction of helping a nervous 10-year-old find their first real chapter book. Money for Eleanor was never about escaping her life. It was about making sure that whatever happened, she would never again feel the fear she felt as a child watching her mother cry in that kitchen. In her 60s, Eleanor began to think about what would happen to the money after she was gone. She had no children. Her ex-husband had long since remarried and moved away. Her sister had passed a few years earlier, but Eleanor had spent 4 decades surrounded by other people's children, in a building full of other people's dreams, and she decided that was where her money belonged too. She met quietly with a lawyer in the next town over, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, who Eleanor swore to secrecy before even explaining why she'd come. Over several sessions, they built a plan. Eleanor wanted a scholarship fund, one that would send children from Millbrook Falls to college, regardless of their grades or their family's income, so long as they showed up, tried hard, and asked for help when they needed it. She wanted the town library to have a permanent fund for its operating costs, so it would never again face the budget cuts that had almost closed its doors in the 1990s. And she wanted a small stipend set aside for the library's staff, so that whoever came after her would never have to live paycheck to paycheck the way she once had. Eleanor Voss passed away peacefully in her sleep on a quiet October morning, 3 months after her 81st birthday. She had worked at the library until she was 78, retiring only when her hands grew too unsteady to re-shelve the heavier volumes. At her funeral, half the town showed up. Farmers, teachers, mail carriers, 3 generations of children she had taught to read. Nobody expected what came next. Patricia Alvarez stood at the reading of the will in the town's small community hall and read a figure that made the room go completely silent. Somebody's coffee cup stopped halfway to their mouth. A man in the back row let out a short, disbelieving laugh, then immediately looked embarrassed for laughing at a funeral. Eleanor Voss, the librarian who rode a bicycle with a cracked basket, who wore darned socks and grew her own tomatoes, had left behind an estate worth $2,360,000. The scholarship fund was announced first, then the library's operating endowment, then the staff stipend, which included, to everyone's surprise, a modest ongoing payment to Doris, her old friend, who Eleanor had listed simply as, quote, the only person who ever asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. The town renamed the library the Eleanor Voss Memorial Library within the year. They placed a small bronze plaque near the front desk, not with a photograph, but with a single line she had asked to be included herself. Read carefully, save quietly, give generously. Doris still visits the library every Tuesday, sitting in the same chair by the window where she and Eleanor used to share tea, though now she brings a cup for herself alone. She says she doesn't mind. She says some part of Eleanor is still there in the quiet hum of the reading room, in the smell of old paper, in every child who leaves with a book tucked under their arm, and no idea what it cost to make that possible. Today, students from Millbrook Falls still walk through those doors. Some of them receiving scholarships they will never know were funded by a woman who spent 41 years stamping due dates onto library cards. $300 at a time, one patient, unglamorous month after another, until an entire town owed its future to a librarian nobody ever suspected was quietly, deliberately becoming a millionaire.